So hi there, EDU 383 members of the class. This is an introductory video to kind of set up some of our ideas as we go forward in the course. And also it's an opportunity to talk a little bit about the textbook and to help enlighten you about your responsibilities and your work in the course and your working with your drive student, because that's where a lot of this work is going to be located in the next several weeks. So to begin, let's talk about kind of the course in general. So there are two strands that are working in the course, and I talk about them in the introduction to our first week, and there's strands that we're going to be following all the way across for the next 7 weeks, all the way across the course. So the first one of these strands is transition in general. So looking at a transition plan for students who are coming out of high school, thinking about vocational information, employment information, creating goals in those areas, education, community living. So community living. What else is there? Community living, leisure time activities is also located. If we look in at a transition plan and talk about how transition plans are developed, we're looking at assessing and developing goals for students throughout these broad capacities. So it's essentially focused on the transition plan for the student. If you have the student's IEP, you'll likely be familiar, and we talked about this a little bit too, you'll likely be familiar with the goals that are going to need to be available for that student in those areas, and those are the goals that that student, at least currently, needs to achieve. So transition is sort of that first strand that will be focused on week to week. The second strand that we're going to focus on is employability. Many of the transition textbooks, much of the transition literature has to do with students, particularly with low incidence disabilities, and their levels of employment in the workforce, which remain historically low, are probably up now to about 65% overall. But as your job developers textbook notes, the success rate in particular for some disabilities is really low, with, for example, an 85% unemployment rate for students who have psychiatric disabilities of some sort. So trying to raise those levels of employment and creating essentially self-fulfilling lives for these students and helping them create self-fulfilling lives is a big part of the work that we can do as transition specialists and special education teachers in secondary environments. So we're going to be focused on those two things: transition on the one hand, and customized employment, employability on the second hand, which is the textbook with which we're working. So the textbook with which we're working, I'm going to recommend you read through thoroughly. Familiarize yourself with each chapter, get an idea of what's involved in each one of those chapters. I don't think skimming and scanning will work as well as it did with our other textbook for 343. So since the chapters are shorter and the text is much more direct and kind of cleanly and clearly written, it should be a manageable read for all of you. So from week to week, as we go forward in the syllabus, I'm going to ask you to complete each one of those chapters. I will highlight different portions in the chapter and the chapters that you read that are particularly important for you to focus on, because they really give you the gist of the chapter, and they also help create for you some of the skills and some of the outlooks that are going to be important for you as a transition specialist going forward. So the context for this, particularly for the employability piece, the transition piece is for U.S. special educators. The employability piece is an additional piece, I want to say. This particular textbook was written for job developers, for job coaches, and for people whose task it is to make sure that people who are differently abled find good employment, worthy employment in the workforce. However, I've assigned it as a text because it opens the door to some of the important perspectives and some of the important resources and some of the important methods that for you as a special education teacher in high school, you can employ regardless, no matter what. And primarily that perspective and those methods have to do with opening up the community. Because one thing that transitions for students who are differently abled tend to show us is that the investment in the community and the understanding of the community through the transition plan, is not always present. So the kinds of methods, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of thorough understanding that this job developer's handbook provides are ideas that you can transfer to your special education position and your special education career at the secondary level. And that's why we're looking at it. In addition to the fact that it's a little bit of a radical outlook, and it looks at employability from a completely different level. There are a lot of acronyms in this book, so I'm going to invite you just to go back, take a look at the index, because all those acronyms are listed alphabetically, and that will help you understand exactly what those acronyms mean and where you can find the meanings of them in the text. So as the book says, we are in somewhat of a dire situation when it comes to people who are differently able, particularly since 2008, 2009, and the economic recession. A lot of the observations that these authors made about employability for people who are differently abled has sort of gone back to square one, because the employment circumstances in the United States have really shifted in many ways and kind of brought us back a decade or so in trying to evaluate, assess, and place people who are differently abled in fulfilling and worthwhile jobs. This particular book is based on a series of projects, as you read, that were developed in the early aughts, that were government sponsored, federally sponsored. Lots of the acronyms that you see in the book are acronyms that have to do with federal law. And of course, the federal government is interested in making sure that people who are differently abled are employable and have good employment prospects. So that's some of the background of the book, and recognizing that this is a significant need, and it's a very significant need in rural areas where we don't have quite the same range of potential employers to look at. So one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do for the course, and we'll talk about this more during our synchronous class, is that you begin to create a community inventory. And some of the ideas in the first chapter of this book, which look toward creating community opportunities, ways of connecting in with the business community, are some of the methods that I'm going to recommend you use or try in order to get those different businesses and different opportunities on the radar for your students who are differently able, and for your drive students in particular. So how far we get with that, I'll also do some of the connecting in terms of BOCES and some of the transition specialists with whom I've had contact with in the past to try to help elevate that particular search for you and to develop different means for you to complete that community survey and look at a customized employment plan and transition plan for your student. So that's also going on in the meantime. And these ideas are evolving, as I mentioned, because I had never used this particular textbook before. So some of the ideas that are here, as interesting as they are, we'll see how far we can get with them and how far we can develop them with our students. So in terms of the book itself, I would focus on pages 6 to 8 in the first chapter, because that gives you some good idea about the structure of customized employment and the kinds of principles that are at work. So there are two things to kind of keep in mind. There's sort of, again, some two kind of categories and ways of thinking about this work that might help. So up until now, the idea of supported employment has been the fundamental ground rule for employment for students who are differently abled and with low incidence disabilities. What this book talks about, and you'll read about supported employment, and that's employment in a sheltered work environment, for example, or employment working steadily with a work coach throughout one's life, or working at the home in which these individuals with low incidence disabilities live. And these are all good opportunities, except that they don't foster the kind of agency and independence that we want these individuals and all individuals to have. So this particular book focuses on customized employment, employment that starts with the individual. So the question really is, rather than the dream job that you might want if you're an individual who's differently able, let's focus on who you are as a person. And that's the big question and the big investigation that goes on, particularly in chapter 2, that when it talks about the process of discovery, which is complicated, which takes some time. The book says 20 to 25 hours over about 4 weeks. How far we get with that, we'll have to see. And that'll be part of the, one of the things that evolves as the course goes on. But there too, you have this balance, this sort of kind of disparate focus. It's not really so much a balance. The dream job piece is certainly important to know, but really what's important to know is who is the person, because it's not a question so much of wishes and desires, although those need to be known on the part of individuals when it comes to employability, community living, and anything else they do from their transition plan. But it's really about getting to know the individual, getting to know the person's interests, and not just their strengths, certainly their challenges, what levels of support they're going to need, and what their interests are and what they can learn. That's an important pivotal piece in the discovery process, because it's looking to evolve the person into a job and to build a job that's going to match the person's interest and the person's ability to learn. So that's a critical difference. And that's sort of where those two methods of developing transition for employability skills diverge. That system of discovery really looks much more at what the individual is like, who this individual is, and as much as possible, how this individual functions and works and is and lives in different contexts, including home. So not just school, not just among friends, not just in informal and leisure time kinds of opportunities, but across the board. So everybody feeds, and all those different environments feed information to who that person is. So creating some sort of ecological understanding of the individual and the different environments in which that person works and studies is also going to be important for you as special educators, transition specialists. And you know, although it won't be your responsibility once you're in a career, in this particular course, you're going to be working and functioning like a job developer. So I think for chapter 2 and for that discovery portion of the textbook, I think what's important to realize is on page 25, the text talks about the fact that disability is one of life's complexities, and that's all it is. We all operate within different complexities, and disabilities is one of those, or having a disability is one of those things. Take notes on the discovery process. So read it through, think about it, annotate it from pages 26 to 28, and from pages 28 to 32, focus on the characteristics of discovery and know how to and learn to do, think about, sort of envision what this would be like for your student, your drive student. How can you implement as much of this discovery process, and in what ways can you implement that discovery process with your students so that potentially in the transition plan, you could also include a reasonable customized employment plan as well. So that's it. I realize it's kind of a long introduction. There's an awful lot to cover. You've got a discussion board this week that's due on Sunday. You've got some reading to do, obviously, and some note taking to do when we join one another in our synchronous class. We'll talk in a little bit more detail about the chapters and some of these ideas. And I guess the last thing I want to say is I'm going to welcome your brainstorming and you're thinking this through along with me so that we can make these experiences for your students in the DRIVE program valuable, create for them a sense of agency, and for you to understand what this model can do and how it might help you develop economic and employment possibilities for your students in the future. So thanks a lot for listening in. I look forward to seeing you later on in the week. Good luck and take care. Thank you.